Hi there, and welcome to our 5th Business Book Club on LinkedIn Live. So if there is anyone watching, then please do let us know where you're joining from, and feel free to comment or ask any questions during our session. So welcome back to Alyson, Gill and Rebecca. Thank you very much for coming along again. Do you want to just quickly do a few brief introductions? So Gill?
Hi, yes, Gill Amos. I'm an executive coach and a leadership development facilitator. And yeah, really enjoy reading to expand my knowledge and learn more.
Excellent. Alyson?
Yeah, also an executive coach, but my speciality is around resilience and looking after yourself. So a bit of well-being, etc., thrown into the mix, and again enjoy reading lots of things on that and expanding my knowledge. Gill and I have done a few courses together and things that are supporting that learning.
Excellent. Rebecca?
Hello, yes, my name is Rebecca Wilson, and I am a business operations consultant, and I help businesses kind of untangle their processes to get the right people doing the right things at the right time with the right systems and processes to support that. So, and I love reading business books.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm Sarah. I'm a LinkedIn career coach and kind of lover of books. And this group has really just given me the accountability to get on with actually engaging a bit more in business books. So I'm mainly listening to them. We've got Jeff Young. Hiya, Jeff. Greetings, LinkedIn ladies. Leaders always dedicated to inspiring everything special. Oh, that's very nice. Thank you, Jeff. Good to see you. Okay, so we were just chatting beforehand a bit about who's read the book, who's listened to the book, and who's watched the TED Talk. So as I said, I've been listening to the books. So Gill, what about you? What's your view?
I started off by reading the book, but then actually started to find that I needed to watch the TED Talks, partly because she refers to them in the book, but also just to see how it came alive for me in the TED Talks. And for me, the TED Talks helped me make more sense of the book.
Right, okay. Alyson?
Yeah, absolutely. I think she tells her story. She calls herself a researcher, storyteller, whatever one of those is. But her stories are very genuine, and in the TED Talks, they do come alive. She's very funny as well, so she adds that element of humour, but also very open and honest about her own experiences. So I would highly recommend people do watch some of the TED Talks. It's a good way to get to know her as a person and where she's coming from.
Excellent. And John's just popped up there to say, has anyone not seen the TED Talk? Well, actually, I've just been saying I haven't, John, so I'm definitely going to watch that later. But thank you for joining as well. And Rebecca?
Yeah, so I watched the TED Talk a long time before I read the book, so I haven't really connected the dots between the two, but I hear you. I think probably for people who are not readers, I think you would get most of it from the TED Talk, and certainly the key points, right? And that's all we're ever looking for is to learn the main good.
Excellent. I always, as I'm listening, I'm always kind of writing down notes on my phone of things that have really stood out for me. And I think probably the thing the most is, which really resonated with me at the moment, is if we stay busy enough, the truth of our life won't catch up with us. And I thought that was really powerful, actually, that particular statement. But anyway, there's loads of really good points. So we will go straight into the conversation. So we're going to go to Alyson to start with. So there's quite a lot of talk in the book about shame. So what is the link with shame and vulnerability, and how do you build shame resilience? So big question, Alyson.
Yeah, now how long have I got? Now, I think it's interesting. Shame has such an implication, doesn't it, in terms of the word? But it is universal. We all have it, and if you're sitting there thinking I don't have it, then you're probably either not empathetic, or you're probably a psychopath, or something like that. That's what she says in the book, because we're all afraid to talk about shame, and that's where it gets its power from. It takes over us. It controls our lives when we don't talk about it, and shame is an intensely painful feeling of believing that we're basically flawed. And there are lots of people who are out there thinking they're not worthy or of being loved or belonging. And there's a lot of examples that we would be familiar with. Things like body image. I mean, they even call it fat shaming. status and money and things around parenting skills. You know, am I a good enough parent? You know, we feel judged by other people, particularly other mothers, and then things like addiction and trauma, which again cause us shame, and there's a lot of reasoning behind that. You know, shame's being called an idiot in front of a client by your boss, or the one that happened to me some time ago, and it reminds me of this. When it came up in the book, was being asked when your baby's due when you're not pregnant, which was quite shocking. And it did happen to me. Luckily, I've got a great sense of humour. But the most common quote I hear from people is, I'm not good enough. And I think as coaches, we all work with that. And that basically is the shame that's underpinned by vulnerability. But what she says in the book is that vulnerability is a strength, it is not a weakness. It takes courage to be vulnerable. And you need to understand, that how to out that shame, for want of a better word, just to make it go away. Because it's easier, as we said, to avoid things than, particularly when we're vulnerable, instead of learning from them. We hide from them. We put them into places where we don't want to talk about them, and that's what gives that shame its power, like being a perfectionist. But the nice thing is, she does say we can build resilience to shame, and particularly by starting thinking about pinpointing what it really means to you as an individual. What are you ashamed of? And as I say, talking about it, bringing it out loud, helps us start to come to terms with it. And we move from shame to empathy. She talks a lot about the conversations when she's done. She had a particular incident where something happened that was fairly traumatic for her. And she talked to two people who she loved. One was her husband and one was her best friend. And the antidote to shame is empathy. And so by talking to them, by sharing the story and receiving their empathy and compassion and support, she was able to balance it out. But the four key drivers to shame and resilience is recognizing what triggers it. Usually that's the same with any kind of gremlin type reaction where we're self-sabotaging. Practice critical awareness, being realistic. That's the whole thing about being a perfectionist and saying, it isn't realistic to think that those goals are always attainable. Reach out, connect, share, and then speak about it, really. So speak shame, because that's what destroys its power. So some interesting concepts in there, I think, around the link between vulnerability and shame. But what I like is that vulnerability is a strength. And again, she did go on to talk about the differences in men and women and how they perceive it. And that vulnerability of being, saying I'm weak. And that's how, potentially a lot of males view it versus females. I just need to be the best of everything, the best mum, the best daughter, the best friend, the best employee, etc. So lots of things that we all experience, and I think some really interesting concepts around how we develop resilience against it.
Cool, good summary. Thank you, Alyson. Rebecca, have you got any views on what Alyson's just said?
Yeah, and I think what for me anyway, what the book does is it gives you the language and gives you the definitions of what some of the things mean. And by understanding what some of the things mean, you can then work out what they mean to you, and you can work out how am I viewing my life, my expectations of myself through a certain lens. So, for example, the idea of a lot of shame being constructed by society. So, I'm in my late 30s. I should have children by now. I should be married by now. I'm not, and I don't. And recognizing that, I might feel shame about that. I don't, but I might. But recognizing it's constructed by the way that society has told us that we should be. If you're a man, you should be strong, you shouldn't cry, all that kind of stuff. Recognizing that it's just a construct, you can then work out, if it's they say this is how the world is, then I can choose to live in a different way, I can choose to address it in a different way, and then I can therefore build resilience to it. So I think for me, the book provides you with a set of rules, a set of language, a set of understanding of what these things actually are and how they've came to be. So then you can put yourself in the world that we all have to live in, sort of thing.
Yeah, really interesting. Gill?
Yeah, I found it really interesting because looking at some of Rebecca's mentioned those life rules, shoulds, must, and oughts. Now, as a coach, one of the things in your very early days as a coach you're trained to look out for is when people are using I should, I must, I ought. There are always things to be alert to. So that was something that really came through. So while she's telling a different story around it, some of the things that, if you like, we've learned, we look out for and you experience yourself, and you hear yourself saying should, must, and ought, and questioning those do come through. And I think the other thing in some of the antidotes, she does mention about gratitude journaling. And that's something we talk about a lot when we're talking about building resilience, being more robust, and strategies for self-management, is about, rather than thinking about what you haven't got, thinking about what you have got. Because I think in what I was looking at, it's this culture of constant comparison that isn't helpful. Rather than being in the here and now and being in the present, what have I got? What can I do? Leading to more options and more openness, and also questioning shoulds, musts, ought all the time. So I found some really useful linkages there, that rather than just thinking we must question shoulds, musts, and ought, she had some reasons, some underpinning why, which is around this shame and the vulnerability as well.
Yeah, so I thought she made some good observations about, there was a part where she talked about what do you do when you're in a supermarket and you walk past a mother with a screaming child? Are you judging? Are you helping? Are you ignoring? And I thought that's interesting, because I'm sure most people have experienced that. And also the difference between the male-female shame in some cases. So she did a lot of her research was initially with women, wasn't it? And then she went on to explore a bit more with men. And I think this is definitely something I've seen, in that sometimes men particularly think around things like unemployment, they won't necessarily reveal that they've been made unemployed or made redundant to their partners. And I definitely have had some male clients like that. And the reason always is that actually my partner probably doesn't really want to know, so they'd rather that I just went ahead and found something else and then told them. So that's really sad. But yeah, I've definitely seen that. Have you seen that, Alyson or Gill, with clients?
I have. I've seen it with again with families where a female client I was coaching said, I can't tell my parents I've lost my job because they'll worry about me. Or my mum will run around and ask everybody that she knows if they can find me another job. Not helpful, but
Yes.
very much, yeah, that whole thing. Like you say, I'd rather tell them when I've got another job, and then they won't have the worry.
Yeah. Okay, Jill, was you going to say something else then?
No, I just think it's about the pressure people put on themselves, and so I think that's the societal pressure.
Yeah.
And it's been broken a bit now, because you do get, it's this male breadwinners thing, which is still there. Although we do get numbers of clients where you've got the female breadwinner, but all they do is take on that whole shame thing that they would have done, sort of 20, 30 years ago if they'd been male. When actually it's perhaps something that should be a bit more shared. And it is just a fact. It is a fact of life. These things do happen.
Yeah. The other reference that I liked was when she talked about Mean Girls, so it was relating to the film, if you've seen that, but where she found that parents were often proud that the girls were popular, rather than kind of talking to them about the bullying, which I thought was really interesting. And again, quite sad.
Yeah, and you need quite a strong school, I think, a strong school ethos.
Yes.
And governors to actually counteract that and be very clear about the values. And when you eventually do sometimes have to speak to parents, very clear about the boundaries. And if here, these are the set of values and rules that you live by.
Yeah.
Choice is yours.
Yeah, no, that's
You're
true.
either in, there are no passengers. These are the rules that we abide by at this school.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Okay, so move on to Rebecca and your question. So how has reading this book changed your perception of what vulnerability is?
Yeah, so I mean, it links into what I was saying before about the language piece, but I came to this book because I wanted to understand more about being authentic. So there's a lot of talk buzzwords out there about leaders being more authentic, about being more authentic in your content if you're a person that posts on social media. And one of the things that was always tied to that is kind of, to be authentic, you need to be vulnerable. And I was like, right, well, I don't understand. I must misunderstand what vulnerable is, because I can't see how I can do that. And my previous perception of being vulnerable was showing that I had lots of problems. So showing that, I had lots of bad things that happened to me. So kind of, bearing all to everybody, and kind of, showing up and not being afraid to say, that, these bad things have happened to me, that kind of sense. But actually, when you read the book, she completely reframes what vulnerable is. It's not about showing your wounds. It's about opening yourself up to be wounded. Which is a very different thing. And of course, then it's much more about, so what might make me vulnerable might make you not vulnerable, right? Talking about something to me might be very vulnerable because I'm worried about putting myself out there and the kind of the wounds I might get as a result of sharing that. So I thought that was a big shift in kind of my understanding of what vulnerable actually is. And I think the other point that she makes in the book, again, my previous perception of vulnerability, when I thought it was about kind of bearing all my problems that ever happened to me, was, are people, how do you get that balance right between sort of, look at me, bad things have happened to me, rather than sharing bad things for mutual healing. And so when I had thought it was about that, I was like, well, I can't share these kind of incredible, vulnerable things, because those kind of things haven't happened to me, and because I wouldn't want to be like, look at me, everybody, some really bad thing happened to me. But what she says in the book, which was really interesting, is she says that if you're being truly vulnerable, as in opening yourself up to be wounded, rather than just showing your wounds, people actually see that, that respect that and want to see that. And she makes the point that you perceive being vulnerable about yourself as a bad thing, but when you see other people being vulnerable, you see it as a good thing. And she says it, that the line that she says it, I want to experience your vulnerability, but I don't want to be vulnerable. Right, that kind of idea that I want to see you. I think you're more authentic when I see you open yourself up to potentially be wounded, but I can't do it in myself. And so, reading this book, if you don't really know what vulnerability is, if you want help on kind of how can I be more authentic, absolutely, it gives you that breakdown as what are all these things and kind of how do they interact with each other. So in answer to the question, completely,
Yeah.
it shifted my kind of perception.
Yeah, that's really good. I liked it when she said about taking off the armor, so showing up and engaging. I thought that was quite a useful quote. Alyson, your views on what Rebecca said?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for me, when she talks about vulnerability, it's that link to the courage piece. So she talks about the courage, and you say it starts with showing up, and the actual book title came from the quote. And I'm hoping I'm not stealing anybody else's lines here, but she talks about the man in the arena. There's the quote from Roosevelt that you have to have the courage to step into the arena in order to be have purpose around why you're doing things, and if we fail daring greatly, which I think is what you say is it's not about showing off our vulnerability. It is about actually wholeheartedly taking the courage to make those steps, to step into that place, and live with things like compassion and wholehearted living, as she calls it, which again I really related to, that overall thing about we have to have meaning in our lives, and what are we doing this for, if we're doing it to get wounded and to show off our scars, then it's very, very different to actually stepping into that space and saying, I know this is going to be difficult, or I know it's going to be painful, but I'm okay with that.
Yeah, that's good. We've just got Emmanuel's just joined from Hong Kong, so thank you for joining. And I put Jane's message up earlier, but she's saying she loved the book and the TED Talk and the podcast, so that's really good to hear. So Gill, any views on what Rebecca and Alyson have just said?
Yeah, I would say so, because I think, like Rebecca, the word vulnerability, when you hear it, it's almost like that military thing, making yourself vulnerable to attack, which is quite unfortunate, really, because we probably all have that perception. Whereas actually it's making yourself, I think, vulnerable to living more completely is probably how I would say. So you're taking, if you like, that courage/risk. You're taking courage with relationships. You're taking perhaps courage in the work that you pick to do, because by picking that project that's perhaps got a slightly, what feels like a scary edge to it, you're opening yourself up to succeed or not to succeed greatly. But you're opening yourself up to that experience. And if you start to restrict that, you live a much more restricted life. You know, restricted in the opportunities that you take, restricted in the relationships that you build as well. So it is about that opening up to take that step and to try something different. And for some people, they have really quite closed down what they do, closed down what they read, closed down how they think, because they're too scared of that vulnerability.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, Gill, we'll go to your question now. So you wanted to talk a bit about chapter 1, so scarcity and the never being enough situation.
Yeah, I thought that it was really useful to read this, because there's a lot of this is about the feeling of the shame of based fear of just being ordinary. People now are particularly hooked up to we need to be extraordinary. And this whole concept of ordinary life being quite a meaningless life. And in some ways, some of the work that we can do around this does feed this. Now, especially with children growing up on social media, reality TV, celebrity, or as I also call it, vacuous culture as well. So I'm only as good as the number of likes you get on Facebook or Instagram. And this does, it's validation for living, isn't it? Quite often. But the problem is, all of this can lead to more grandiosity, entitlement. It feels like it soothes, but actually all it does in the long term is lead to more pain and disconnection rather than more connection. It's actually make us more disconnected, because we're connecting with almost, it's not my words, not hers, this fantasy being as well. And so a lot of the behaviours that people dealt are a whole link to this protecting ourselves. So this scarcity one, this culture of scarcity, is not the scarcity of resources. You know, have I got enough water, got enough milk, or this time round, this, you know, have we got enough energy to get ourselves through the winter? The answer is we used to manage quite well without central heating. So of course we've got enough, just not as much as we're used to as well. And also the way society is dealing with these things. So rather than looking at scarcity, coming together to do things, it's people get angry, they get scared. And what we call the book we read about, Are You Listening? Why That Matters. They don't actually listen. They're behaving like they've been chased by a bear. So they're actually at each other's throats as well. And this is actually based on each person's scarcity. So if you think about it, and that's affecting every part of human life. So it's actually thinking about how do people respond if you actually have the phrase, never blank, 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 enough. And I thought this is a really, really good activity to do to some of my coaching clients who are in this space and never feeling good enough, never perfect enough, never thin enough. That's a big one for women, I think, particularly. Never powerful enough, never successful enough. There's always somebody who's more successful. Never smart enough, and that could be physically smart or it could be intelligent smart. Never certain enough, never safe enough, or never extraordinary enough. And in a way, there's many organisational cultures, that last one, if you're where you have to record what you've done in the past year and present that towards your year end, they ask people like, yeah, well, what's mega about what you've done? What's really alpha about it? I.e., subtext, not extraordinary enough, not special enough. So this whole thing about not being enough. But there's also a thing about this scarcity. I don't have enough time. I don't have enough time. The company provides a lot for my development, but I never have enough time. And we don't have enough of, you know. Another thing, people going to bed thinking about what they haven't done rather than thinking about what they have achieved that day. And that's that whole thing about gratitude and gratitude journaling. What have I done today that's good? And that can be the safety, the money, the love, resources, anything that feels restricted or lacking. And we spent a lot of time about what we haven't achieved, what we haven't done, and what everybody else has. And this can be by comparing ourselves to these media images of what life should like. Marketeers love it, don't they? You only have to watch television to look at the perfect family, perfect body, perfect life, perfect whatever. And it's all this media-driven stuff. Or it can be about comparing yourself to somebody else you know. And that's something particularly do come across in coaching. Who are you comparing yourself to? And when you start to unlock that, you can actually find how that's really damaged somebody's confidence as well. But what happens from that comparison and this scarcity, I've never enough, never got enough, never being enough, is then you get into the shame. You also get into the, and thinking about the environments, the work environments that are based on shame, you know, belittling people, telling them they're not enough, or comparing people. Now, a bit of healthy competition, great. But when it gets to ranking, which we have in organisations because we have forced ranking for salary. So whole organisational cultures are built around comparison. And we have to think sometimes about how that helps. Interestingly, of all the research they've done about performance-related pay, if you ask the people who do research on there, shows it doesn't work, which is not what people in HR want to hear. It's what I remember Professor David Guest saying when I was doing my master's degree. We've told them it doesn't work because we researched it. And still it all went ahead. So it's interesting. And that comparison, that healthy competition profiles, this ranking, reminded me of my primary school. Whereas at the end of every week, you had to do English test and a math test to making sure you were doing your mental arithmetics and your spelling. Now, that's really good for reinforcement, but it's what they did. Because we were sitting in 3 rows, the top row, the middle row, and the bottom row, and never mind 30 in a class, there were 42 or 43 in a class. And hey, too many in a class, but I still survived, so you can do. And if it happened on a Friday when you added up your mental arithmetic score and your spelling score, if it was lower than the top person in the middle row, or if you're in the middle row and it was lower than the top person in the bottom row, you had to physically swap seats, leave who you were sitting next to and developed a relationship with, and go down to the middle row. Or if you're in the middle row, you could then move up to regain your place in the top row. And if you're in the middle row, you could then be in the bottom row. And some of the poor people who really struggled to get out of the bottom row into the middle row. And this was in a school that was already streamed. So how did that ever really help people learn? Because if you're in that feeling of shame about what I'm achieving, how are you ever really going to release the dopamine in your brain, which open up all the learning centers in your brain to make you want to learn? And interestingly, I remember on Friends Reunited when it was still a thing, looking at some of those people I recall being in the bottom row, my primary school, who were then in the A stream of the secondary school, who then went on to have successful lives and careers, but probably still always thinking, am I good enough? Am I clever enough? And that's something which has actually been with me throughout my life. Am I clever enough? Even though I went to a red-brick university, equivalent to the American Ivy League, even though I've got a master's degree, even though I've worked with, well-known organisations all of my life. So that one can be particularly cruel. And that, of course, then also with organisations that are about blame cultures, bringing shame and having that way of coercive control as well. So what you then get is disengagement, because people won't be ready to, if that whole scarcity of things, to actually take risks and try things differently. You know, because why would I? Because I'm going to be shamed, I'm going to be compared, I'll have to move down a row, leave my friends who I like sitting round, and watch somebody else who perhaps I don't like very much move up and take my place in the middle row. I always escaped the bottom row, but I felt complete empathy for those people who'd got that label, because it was so unfair as well.
It's really interesting. So we are running quite short on time now, so it's really good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gill. So Alyson, any comments on what Gill's talked about?
No, but I can resonate with the experiences early on in life, and I think we do a lot of damage through some of that stuff that people hold on to. And I suppose the thing about shame is getting it out and talking about it, and therefore lessening the importance of some of those experiences by talking about it.
Yeah, Rebecca?
Yeah, and again, I think it's the language that she provides for you. So that list of you know, like never good enough, never perfect enough, never thin enough, the whole list. It allows you then to see, have I been saying these words to myself, and then to say, well, thin enough compared to who, you know, smart enough compared to who, you know, and again, it provides you with that ability to drag yourself out of it and work out, you know, what's happening.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. So we're out of time now, so we didn't talk about this, but anyone got a key point that they want to leave with? So Gill, over to you first.
Well, I think it's actually really quite useful to do that never whatever enough exercise, and then go through and do the opposite round enough. I am enough, and turn it round. Just by saying that, I think actually shift your thinking.
Yeah. Okay, Alyson?
And I think following on from that, you know, believe that you are worthy of love and belonging, because being unworthy is self-sabotaging. You know, nobody else is saying that, just yourself. And, you know, back to the having courage, have courage to enter the arena. It says, he who fails while daring greatly.
Okay, Rebecca?
Yeah, I echo both of those points, and also kind of say this is the type of book that I normally wouldn't pick up. It's very kind of about your feelings and all the rest of it, but actually it's written in a way that's quite accessible to people like me. And you know, if you're kind of looking to understand it in a bit more depth, because she's a researcher, it's, you know, it's well researched. It's not fluffy, so it's a great book if you're looking to understand any of these words, but don't want to go too fluffy.
Yeah, that's good. I think that probably the last thing that I wanted to say was the fitting in versus belong, and I thought that was a really interesting section where she talked about you might fight to fit in somewhere, but actually when you find the place that you belong, then you just are. So I thought that was a really good point as well. So Jeff's just saying, wonderful conversation, got to run, have a terrific Tuesday. Thank you, Jeff. So hopefully next time we'll be back. We haven't quite decided yet, so we will schedule something and let people know. So thank you very much for joining, as always, ladies. It was a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.